So the oral SAC 3, the last of the SACs that you completed a couple of weeks back now, it's difficult to generalize with feedback for the whole class for this. Here are some dot points that things that we thought would be helpful um, as feedback for a whole class. One might be just including quotes from significant key literature that you're using. There was we just noticed that there was space for that, I suppose, in some of your oral presentations. So I guess that's just a little tip you could bring towards your final oral at the end of the year. Um, the other thing to mention here are clear reasons for hypotheses that emerge from the literature. So your hypothesis is more than just an educated guess. So it was really, really great that a lot of people were speaking to their to give an outline of their hypotheses. But we wanted to cement that, ground that within the literature. It needed to be supported by best evidence from your readings and literature. So that was something else that we thought could be easily kind of fine-tuned in the oral SAC 3, and perhaps that's something to return to at some stage as you start to work towards your final paper. These are the next is just a general comment about all of the assessments in extended investigation. You've probably clued onto this already. The key action thinking words are explanation, elaboration, justification, and synthesis in your research. So the way that you apply these in your thinking and your writing and your oral presentation are really, really important for the subject. So explaining key concepts, theories, elaborating on central aspects of arguments, evidence, and reasoning that's central to you and your research, giving justification for the research and design elements, things like suitability, objectivity of the study. And lastly, and this comes a bit more towards your final paper, making connections between other concepts, theories, and studies to develop and progress the research. So the idea of drawing upon connecting ideas to make new information, new exploration in the research. Is that before? Is that does that sound okay as a general kind of feedback on the orals? Is there any? It's probably a couple of weeks back now for everyone. Um, I think the main thing is it gives you a good taste of what the oral presentation at the end of the year will feel like. And essentially you'll be doing a kind of similar thing, really. It's just that you'll have much more in development of your research findings and discussions. Yeah, that was really the difficult thing about this. Thanks, Annabelle. Time frame is just such a limitation for getting all that info out. So do you mean the 8 minutes to present and then the 8 minutes to reply, those type
I,
things? Yeah.
I just mean like all that feedback. I feel like I understand what that is, but like to say that all concisely is hard, and
Yeah.
to make time like to do the elaborating of a central aspect maybe meant that you had to get rid of a bit of a key concept that was kind of necessary. Like I feel like a lot of stuff got scratched because there was more important things, but that meant that not everything was covered.
Yeah, and it's often a lot of it depends on the particular study as well, but often there's a lot of um, related issues or problems involved in a study that require explanation to some degree. Um, so, so being discerning, what are the things that are most relevant for your research can be good. Just a general kind of question to ask yourself. Um, how is what I'm saying, how is what I'm talking about explaining, how is this relating to what I am seeking to do in this study? I know what you mean a little bit there, Annabelle, as well. Um, and it might be a matter of the way that you think about that starts to shape the way that you start to write your final written report as well. What things you start to emphasize as central to your research. Um, yeah, so to speak to that question, Jessica, would you suggest including quotes? Yeah, yeah. Um, especially again coming back, especially if it's central, if you're drawing a lot from a particular piece of literature, maybe you might want to just use a quote in the way that they explain a concept. Um, that can be useful. Obviously, you don't want to go on with a quote because the information may not be conveyed in an oral situation. But if it's just a sentence or so, that might be really, really useful. Yeah, yeah. Is there any further questions about or comments about the SAC before I move on to talk more about the critical thinking test coming around the corner? Okay, well, there'll be some more specific comments, I suppose, to individuals as well. So these. It's difficult to generalize to a great extent, but you'll get some more tailored comments in your actual reporting back on SAT 3. Okay, so if possible, um, for you, I'd like you to pull open, if you can, if you have your responses to the trial test that we did a couple of weeks ago, gearing up for the critical thinking test. I think it comes along in about 2.5 weeks or so. So this week and next Tuesday, we're going to talk through some of the questions from the critical thinking test, elaborate on some of the examiner report comments, and give some a bit more information about how you can start to prepare or start to think about what questions are asking and demonstrate your thinking about the particular questions. Okay, so for today, we're probably just going to focus on some of the first couple of questions and some of the questions relating to issues. Just before I go on, has everyone completed the test? It's okay if you haven't for whatever reason. Um, it's all, maybe it's a bit of a blur, but can people remember back to the time that they did complete it? Kind of situate yourself in that position a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, that's okay, Mustafa. Thanks for letting me know. And we'll get on to that as well. Okay, great, great. And if you did receive your, I think we sent back people that completed the test for VCAR in the trial conditions. We sent back your responses. If you have that, it'd be good to open that up as we start to talk through the test a bit, both today and next Tuesday as well. Okay, so situating yourself back to sit in this trial test, it's just the 2020 test from last year. So it's exactly the same as extended investigation students sat this last year. The first question was a drop and drag kind of situation. The main thing was that there's a series of arguments for, just circle that, for a given proposition and against, and the idea that you would drag and drop them into their appropriate place. I guess the conceptual idea was that they should align within this table. So what is said here should more or less correspond as an argument or proposition against on this side. So, you can probably zoom in if you can. The PowerPoint you're seeing might be a bit small. It might be helpful to zoom in if you need to. How'd we all go with this first one? If we want, we can probably have a go at it now. Was there anything that you used that was useful?
Can I just double check that in the ones that we got back, it obviously has our answers in red. Is that because that's just showing that that's where we put it, or because it's wrong?
Not because it's wrong. No, no. So you haven't got any comments just yet?
Oh, it's literally just what you wrote.
Yeah, it's just what you wrote. Yeah, yeah. We're going to actually look through it and provide some more specific feedback before the critical thinking test. But what you got at the moment, it's there just as whatever you wrote at the time, and we haven't assessed it just yet. So we'll do you can probably assess yourself a little bit at the moment, but we'll actually go through that and give some tips and comments in the next couple of weeks. Does that make sense? That's okay?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Otherwise, I actually got everything wrong because everything's red. But I think it's just our answers are in red, so you can tell which ones you moved.
Yeah, exactly. And look, the first couple of ones, because there's either a correct answer or not a correct answer in these first couple of sections, you could probably actually mark this yourself, or you could have a really good understanding of what you got for that. So I guess the other tip to emphasize, and they mention this as a strategy in the examiner report, one good way is just to run through. So here are the three given propositions. First thing to do is just to work out which ones of these are for and against. So work out, okay, is this proposition down the bottom, the current birth rate is below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per women, is that a for or an against? And do that with all three of them. That's a nice quick way to kind of demarcate the two sections. And then it's a matter of going through and trying to correspond either implicitly or explicitly. Mostly it's implicitly. The ones that best relate to each other as a type of proposition and objection. They should be in conflict with each other in some way. So, for instance, the last one down the bottom, migration is a good way of sustaining our current population. It's talking about population, so it seems to be talking mostly to this one here. So you could just drop and drag it into there. Would you like me to talk through the next one, or should I move on to a next question? This one.
I think talk through the next one.
The next question or the next proposition? Sorry.
Well,
could you please let us know where you would put them?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So this bottom one, so current birth rate is below the replacement. I would place that here. Can you see the green that I'm pointing out? Or is that just me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you mean top right?
Bottom left.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
I would put it on the for category at the bottom. The next one, parents make great sacrifices to have children. I can't see that. and this benefits society as a whole. So I'm looking for something. I'm just going to scan my eye. I'm looking for something about sacrifices, benefits to society. Well, firstly, I ask, okay, is this a for or an against? So society should offer financial support to people who are raising children.
Are the correct answers on the next slide? Would it be easier? Is that it?
Oh, yep.
Does it make life a little easier? Or do we sort of not remember what we'd put in? Doesn't highlight. Oh, there we go. A, B, and C. There we go. Yep.
Parents make great sacrifices to have children, and this benefits society as a whole. Corresponds with the against argument. People have children for personal reasons and should not expect support from others to raise their children.
Just, I suppose, maybe you've already cottoned onto this, but the simple strategy is to try and put the answers into the for and against columns first, and try and work out which side they're asking for. And once you've done that, then start to identify which one they're directly in opposition to. I think Julian sort of alluded to that. So just that's a little trick for that one. Yeah, it's a two-step. First, work out if it's a for or against, and then once you've done that, then try and look for what it might be opposing. And the third trick for these is sometimes it's the language or the wording that gets you. And sometimes some students have found it useful to rewrite the statement they're trying to work out what it opposes. So I'm just trying to think of a nice example there. So I think number 3, where C opposes number 3. So the 4 is, if we want more children, we should support those who accept the challenge of raising them. And then against, raising a family is a matter of individual choice and responsibility. So raising a family, that phrase is effectively the same as if we want more children. Do you see how they've used language there? They're saying the same thing, just in a slightly different way. And so sometimes if you're stumped, try and look at the phrasing and break it down and see if it's possible to maybe switch a phrase around, and that might be the way into trying to work out where the opposition is. So I hope that's sort of helpful. But I get the sense that everyone's pretty happy with that first one. I think it was number 3 from memory that people, would I be right in saying that it was number 3 that people struggled with? I remember in the, when people were coming out, people seemed to say that. I don't know if people remember. Should we press on to 2?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Number 2, you might have seen something similar with what we've been hammering home a lot with the Toulmin idea of critical thinking. This is a variation of that, really. There's a proposition followed by an argument. You're looking to drag and drop, find the opposing argument, find evidence, find elaboration, and a counter argument. And all of those terms are given some description in the question as well. For the most part, and this goes with students that did this question last year, a lot of people were able to find the evidence. A lot of people found that. And a lot of people found the opposing argument, but not many people were finding or making the drag and drop to the appropriate elaboration and counter argument. There was a lot of, because they're doing something a little bit similar. I think that's where a lot of the difficulty with this question came about. So have a look at what you did and how you dragged and dropped there, and see if you're doing something similar. as you can see, if you look at the percentage of marks, a lot of people are getting 2. 48 students last year got 2 marks. Only 5 students got 3, 12 students got 4. That gives you a sense that a lot of people were able to pick up 2 marks, challenging to pick up the 3rd and 4th. And that's usually because this elaboration and counter argument are conflated a little bit. So we'll go through the proposition itself. Funding for the expansion of the Australian War Memorial is justified because the armed forces are practically and culturally important. Okay. The evidence, information that supports the argument, that was where it talked about more than 100,000 blah 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 have died in military service. And I think that's kind of, a lot of people can see that on how that would be evidence to support the argument. The opposing argument was statement 2. Challenges the proposition and the argument, and really it's the only one that's strongly challenging the proposition. Helping veterans damaged by war is more important than symbolic gestures. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good, but Julian's point there, strong. You know, the counter argument is pretty strong here. You notice that the language it's using must be recognised. Okay, so it's not just putting forwards a fact, but it's putting forwards that it's necessary. You know, it's putting a lot of heavy weight on that. And so normally when you're offering a counter argument, you're wanting to really hit home why the other view is wrong. So maybe one of the little pointers there is, when you're looking for the counter argument, looking for perhaps some strongly worded language. Yeah, and you're not alone there, Annabelle. I think this is the problem, and what we're trying to do is tease out what might be the difference. And can I say that it's really tricky, and what they're asking us to do, and so I think keeping that little point in mind, that the counter argument to the opposing argument. So, you know, it says there, so the opposing argument to the idea that we should have a war memorial is that it's more important. So what is it? Statement 2.
Symbolic gestures.
Yeah.
So
Opposing argument, yep. Having a war memorial is a symbolic gesture. And then the rejection of that claim is, well, no, we must recognise the sacrifice of those who have served, you know, in our country or whatever. So, you know, so I'm also trying to put things in different words. Sometimes when you do that, when you express the idea of the phrase, it sort of allows you to sort of think out the argument beyond the language that's being used. So maybe what you need to do is, in the counter argument, look for a definitive, strong, must, you know, a sort of a definite statement that's claiming absolute status. Sorry, Julian.
yeah, so maybe another way to think about it. So the elaboration should be doing something between, making the connection between these in some way, or providing information that would unpack the connection being made. Whereas the statement 1, which is the counter argument, should be trying to respond to the objection. So I don't know if you can read the bottom there. The difference between an elaboration and counter argument is the most difficult distinction in most lines of arguments like this. In this case, statement 6 is the elaboration, as it suggests what's culturally important means in the given argument. So it's talking to this. aspect of the argument. It's a quite subtle kind of thing, and challenging. But just remembering that idea of the line of argument, what each part of the argument is trying to do, might be useful to start to pick up on those really, really subtle aspects. I wanted to go over the last question as well, question 10, because it's kind of doing a similar type of thing as well. The idea of that line of argument is also in this one as well. This was a really, really hard one for students last year, and a couple of pointers can easily direct you away from making some ill errors, I suppose. So there's some information that's given in this last question. Just going to underline this. So so the proposition from an argument for the proposition are shown in the diagram below. Write an opposing argument that directly challenges the proposition and the argument. So you're looking for something that's doing a bit of both, really. And here's the important thing to remember. Do not merely state the opposite of the proposition or the argument. So do not just go in and go, okay, the proposition is wearing a helmet when cycling, that should not be compulsory. So I'm just going to write wearing a helmet should be compulsory as my objection. Because that's really just stating the opposite. But what we're looking for is something a bit more in an objection. It should be responding to some aspect of the argument and proposition, but not just stating the opposite as a contradiction. Does that help there with this one? And then you have it. Yeah, sorry.
Could you have said at the start, like, that it should be compulsory? And I know that's like directly saying the opposite, but then follow that up with more that makes it less copying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you should be having a because.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's what you need to do is do exactly this. Wearing a helmet when cycling should be compulsory because, and then you've got to give your argument to support that claim.
Mm-hmm. So you might say, because it gives the bike riders a sense of safety, which would actually encourage cycling.
Yeah, or because it impedes people's liberties.
Mm-hmm.
People should be free to choose.
Yep. When it says there, do not merely state the opposite, that just means if you just left it as wearing a helmet should be compulsory, and that was it, that was your response, you wouldn't really actually pick up any marks for that. So the key thing is the because and the explanation of why that's needed.
Julian, Mustafa's got a good question about the marking schema. Do you need 3 arguments for 3 marks?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mustafa. No, you don't need 3 arguments, and it's probably not helpful to think about it in terms of that. We're looking for one objection and a strong explanation for why that opposing argument is doing a good job to respond to the argument and proposition. So you don't have to list, 3 different objections in this response. And as a general rule, you don't have enough time to think up 3 different arguments. So it's best to put all your kind of energy into developing and teasing out one really, really good opposing argument, and giving some understanding, giving some reason for why that's a good one. I'll just go over. So if you're looking at your own responses, if you want to do a self-mark or something like that, here's some suggested responses of things you could be talking about, but they're not prescriptive. It's not like the examiner would be looking for these things. But you might talk about helmets can encourage cycling by making it less dangerous. You can see how that's an opposing argument. Cycling is discouraged by other factors, etc. I won't go into that too much.
Would another way of sort of talking about this one be that you've got to criticize the argument that's given and say why the argument's not very good? So instead of giving your own argument separate from that argument, you need to really be trying to talk about why that argument has some flaws in it.
Yeah, you might follow up. So if you've explained your opposing argument, you could pick up a point by saying why this argument is not convincing. And that would be a good strategy, because remember that we want to look for something that directly challenges the proposition and argument. So if you're talking to things that directly challenge any aspect of this, talking about discouragement, compulsoriness, that's going to make your response really relevant and something, and show that you're directly challenging the proposition and argument. Whereas if you're talking about things that are kind of unrelated, you go on a little bit of a tantrum about civil liberties and everyone's losing their civil liberties at the moment, and it's a disgrace, and the government should just wake up to itself. You can see how that's not really directly challenging the argument here. So keep an eye on that, the way that you can talk to features of the argument. Yeah, so talking about the consequences, I think that's a good approach, Annabelle. So we might talk about implications. If it was the case that everyone la la la, then this would happen. This is a bad thing to happen, therefore we should do this.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a nice, yep. Drawing out the implications. That's a really nice way to go about critiquing the argument. Yeah, that's good. Nice sort of description of how to think about that. Yeah.
Shall we go on to, we've keeping an eye on time. So we're also going to come back to the critical thinking next week as well. But if we have time, we're just going to talk about questions 3 and 4 next. Okay, here we go. So questions 3 and 4, they're kind of about an issue. One was about media ownership, and just the feedback that we got from a few class members walking out from the exam from the trial test were, that was a bit of a doozy. I was going okay, question 1, question 2, and then I got to question 3 about media ownership, and I just kind of struck a bit of a dead end, or a bit of a blankness, I suppose. Question 4, I think, was a little bit easier. It was about mobile phones. So there was the issue itself was quite digestible, I think, and quite immediate. But we'll get to that in a moment. These ones, we're looking for your skills in analysing and evaluating issues and arguments. So the assessors, they're looking for understanding the nature of the issue, and so they'll be choosing very broad issues that you just kind of think about or are able to engage with in an everyday situation. So things that are kind of in the media over the last 5 or 10 years, so contemporary types of issues. You can't really prepare for in any kind of specific sense, but just by reading newspapers or internet online newspapers and things like that, you'll have some understanding of the issue itself. The claims that you're making in these, we're looking for them to be plausible, reasonable. sometimes in the way that you're talking or the way that you're writing about this aspect, you'll be using both implicit and explicit reasoning that's leading to your judgment. A really good idea is to try and think about how you can make your reasoning really explicit for your reader. Okay. And also we're kind of looking for evidence and examples that might be used to offer support. Things not to include here, they don't want to see rhetorical or persuasive devices. So to say something like option D appeals to the emotional, persuasively appeals to the emotions of the reader, and therefore it's the most persuasive proposition. That's not really engaging with the reasons of it. It's kind of doing an English persuasive analysis, which is not going to be helpful in this situation. Likewise, to ask rhetorical kind of questions will not be really helpful for you in this in the whole test, but in specifically these sections 3 and 4, questions 3 and 4. Okay, so there's a premium on why you're making a judgment, how it is that you're explaining your reasoning that's working towards that judgment. Okay, it's all a bit abstract, so let's just jump into what the questions were. The first one, ownership of news networks, is subject to government regulation in Australia. Consider the following arguments for and against the proposition below. So there's arguments for and against relating to this proposition. Media organisations should be allowed to own more than one national news media network. So you can zoom in if you can't see that clearly. So in this question, you're asked to respond to which one of the arguments, A to J, that restrictions on media ownership do you find most convincing and why? Analyze the arguments presented. Do not offer your own opinion about the proposition. So I can understand this is a bit of a challenging one. Thinking about strategies here, one useful strategy is try not to bite off too much more than you can chew in the amount of time that you have. So sometimes it's best to focus in on one particular for or against proposition rather than trying to make a judgment on all of the propositions, because you might just end up spending too much time trying to cover everything about this without getting the depth and detail that you want. So in the examiner report, they write, the issue of controlling the ownership of news media is complicated. And for this question, students were given different arguments about the issue and asked to decide which argument is most useful. The task was a matter of deciding which of the statements is the most substantial or decisive. So which one is the real decisive one that's persuading you one way or the other on the proposition. Higher scoring students offered reasoning for one argument. Okay, so how does, I guess maybe firstly, what did everyone, if you can remember back, what proposition did you end up choosing? I don't think there's any one proposition that you say, oh, that's the one. So it's really about the reasoning that's given. but maybe just getting the sense of what we chose could direct our discussion next. Okay, great. So if we're choosing, so E, G, maybe J as well, you'll probably end up talking about the broader concepts that are underlying this a little bit as well. When we talked about the implicit reasonings, sometimes you start to talk about bigger things like democracy, freedom, free media, and you kind of need to engage with those bigger, broader things as well. And maybe qualify what is meant by a term like that. Maybe just a little sleight of hand. Democracy is blah blah blah. Okay, so I might just read out. This is an example of seems like a high scoring response. I think it only starts to get high scoring towards the end of this response. So we'll look out for that. Argument J is the most convincing as it appeals to the desire of citizens to be informed and educated, implying that in the absence of news media regulation, citizens will be poorly informed and their ability to receive a diverse range of truthful content will be compromised due to mass ownership. So it's kind of like what you were talking about before, Annabelle, about drawing out the implications that follow on. Then it writes, this argument is stronger than all others as it utilizes a fundamental assumption of democracy that citizens are entitled to determine their own perspective based on complete knowledge of available information.
Just the other sort of point to maybe mention that might be worthwhile is that it's not just that this person's written clearly, but they're making the linkages between the points they're making. It's very clear how their argument fits together. So this person's somewhat subtle in their writing, so it's hard to see, so at the start there, they've written argument J is the most convincing as it appeals. So that as there is really the thing that, that the language of argument, bringing that through and allowing that to come in, and forcing yourself to explain why it is that you're saying whatever it is that you're saying. And then in bold, that second bit there, this argument is stronger than all others as, okay, so they're really making it clear where their argument is kicking in. So just one thing, again, if you've struggled with this question and you're feeling that you're not sure, when you're going through, and if you've got a chance to review what you've done, just look for the language of argument. Where are the signposts, or where is your argument? Have you just made a whole collection of statements and just hoping that it sort of will say something, or are you trying to make it clear why this is the case, why that is not the case, etc.? And are you making that clear to your reader, how this all fits in together? Yeah. But yeah, this is drawing out the implications. Sounds like a really great strategy for this one. If we so what this person is doing is saying, if we accept argument J, let's imagine a world in which this would be the case. What sorts of things would occur in that world that we wouldn't really want? So that's and that's coming back to the really nice point that you made, Annabelle. Yeah, that's a really great, nice strategy.
Yeah, and there's a clear understanding of the issue a little bit here as well. So I think that's the connecting the dots here with the link into democracy, um, and the position of knowledge and information that's needed to sustain democracy, democratic processes. So the next one is a similar type of task. The proposition is banning mobile phones in school will improve student learning and well-being. This one was probably, to my mind, the best responses were in this from last year's students from this question. So, and you can see why, because I think we're all pretty familiar with the debate about mobile phones in schools. So students kind of had a rich source of material to draw upon. And I think they were much more comfortable writing about this. I don't know if that was the same for everyone who did this question, this trial test and this question. I guess the only other thing is to think about maybe banning mobile phones in schools will improve student learning and well-being. So maybe there's a tendency, if you weren't checking yourself, to wander off from this actual central aspect of the proposition. We're really linking it back to student learning and well-being. So if you were talking about, I don't know, student engagement, maybe it's not necessarily directly responding to student learning and well-being. Or maybe you're just talking about well-being, and didn't really cover or think about how student learning played a role in this. That could also be a factor that might just limit to getting that really, really, really high kind of response for this. This will probably take us to the end, I suppose. Oh, would you like me just to read this as an example of a high scoring? Maybe as we're listening in, try and see where the language of argument is being used in this response. So if you can try and find out or follow where the arguments are signposted as you're reading this, would be a helpful little task to do as I read this out. So phones are extremely powerful devices that can be of great use in the classroom environment. Mobile phones can serve as a backup to when other devices fail. If a student's laptop is having technical issues, being able to rapidly switch to a mobile device would be highly helpful in seamlessly continuing to be able to follow along with the class. Some classes, such as media and design classes, can benefit from mobile phone's ability to take pictures, as ideas that may be of interest to the students and teachers can be captured more easily. Mobile phones are also a great safety net in many ways. Having a way to contact help on hand can be highly comforting knowledge to many people. For many people, school can also be a highly stressful and negative environment. Having a mobile phone as a form of escapism can be highly helpful. Mobile phones can also help prevent bullying, as if students have a direct line of communication, and school resources could be applied more readily and rapidly to those who need it.
So look, one of the things I was going to say is that that's well written, but more importantly than it being well written, it's very, very clear what the argument is and how that hangs together. Just, reason after reason after reason, and you can see how that all links in really nicely. So don't be too alarmed that you have to all of a sudden become a brilliant writer. I mean, this is well written and it's really nice and clear. But yeah, you can see more, that how these arguments just sort of flow on from each other, and they build up that case so that once you get to the end of that little paragraph, you're sort of trying to think of what possible counter arguments could you offer. It seems so convincing. The other thing I was going to ask, Julian, one of the things that I've noticed students have done in the past, so a trap perhaps that students can fall into is to invent a fact or invent
Oh yeah,
statistics.
yes. James by Jones in 2002 proved that mobile phone use improved well-being in students, something like that.
Yeah.
So
But-
I think that's stopped happening, but it was happening a lot, and it wasn't looked upon kindly. It was like people were making up literature to suit them in these responses.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't fall into the trap of just saying, you know what, or even thinking, gee, I read an article ages ago that said something about this. I'll just reference it. And then say, oh, well, according to Jones, in the article, and then you just maybe make it up or write, and then you don't give an argument. You just sort of name checking someone. That's not going to cut it. Look, I can see also that sometimes with these subjects, you might come across a topic that you've never really thought about much. And so one of the things that has also worked for students, you do get some pen and paper, even though the exam is done on a computer, you do get some pen and paper, and you might want to just do a quick little brainstorm, do a little concept map. It might help you just to think of all the elements, just to get the juices flowing. That might be a little idea if you're hitting a subject that you haven't really thought about and not really sure how you could sort of generate some reasons and arguments off your own bat. But yeah, certainly don't invent facts. I know that there was a period where people were saying 83% of people would agree with me, and so I must be right. That sort of stuff. Don't do it. Sorry. What if you do actually know that something is scientifically proven? For example, that people can be addicted to phones. Well, if you can explain it instead of just saying, well, it's true because it's scientifically proven. Just saying something is scientifically proven is not an argument. It's a description of why something might be true, but it's not an explanation of why something might be true. Does that make sense? So for instance, if you can remember a piece of research, so let's say you remember an article or some research that actually demonstrated that people can be addicted to phones, then you can describe that. But you can see how this answer here doesn't go that deep into it. It's just trying to think of a whole bunch of sort of straightforwards and simple reasons to make that argument as strong as they possibly could. Yeah, I hope that sort of gets the balance right there. Yeah, you don't want to be describing in depth a piece of research that you remember, because that might, you might spend a whole paragraph describing one piece of research, and it doesn't really allow you to put in more reasons, even though it might be a strong one. And would you say, Julian, more arguments the better for this one? Because this seems like a real,
Yeah, yeah. This is quite a. I mean, I kind of said before, look, it's better to hone in on an argument and expand as you can, rather than try to pack in as much as you can. And what I meant by that was sometimes just in the stress of the whole situation, sometimes people go for a scattergun approach and just try to kind of reel off as much bullets for their argument, as much kind of claims for their argument in the hope that one might stick well. But if you do feel like you can follow on one reason from another, that's a good approach. So see that, like for instance, in this one, they've gone into some detail about specific examples of classes. So there's a bit of a change of tack there, I suppose. Did I answer that? So I guess there's a tendency, don't go too over with listing as many related reasons as you can. If you can be relevant and on track with the reasons, then that's better.
All right. It's day 2, or for some of you, I think maybe the term hasn't even started. I think we might put the brakes on now.
Yeah. And
Does it-
look, this is all, so we'll probably give you a bit more feedback to your specific ones, but at the moment, it's good to just, while it's immediately with you, just to have a look at your responses. Just go to yourself, okay, how could I have just kind of changed this, my approach, or further kind of extended my response? In what way could I have done that? So you can do that at the moment, but we'll have a look at your specific trial responses, get some feedback before the actual test itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. The other, and then next week we're going to sort of keep on going through the next half. Well, we did a bit more than half, or roughly half of the test. We'll go through and have a think about how you can approach those ones. They're more, these are the more critical thinking in terms of putting forward arguments and analyzing arguments, whereas the next one's more research focused, talking about the elements of research. But I feel like that'll give you a sense of it. And the other thing I'd really like you to think about is, imagine if you were writing this exam. I think this exam usually gets finalized by around March, April, probably even a bit earlier. And so the examiners are sitting there trying to think of topics that will be accessible and won't disadvantage anyone.
I can't help but think that a lockdown question could be in there. That's just
So it might be
as
good
an
for
issue, as you know, going into lockdown, a hard lockdown versus a soft lockdown.
Yep.
Something like that, an issue like that.
I'm willing to bet money that either question 3 or 4 in the exam this year will be a question about whether or not we should have a lockdown. And so you might want to start thinking about what are the kinds of arguments, or even put forwards a little paragraph on your own, just to think about what kind of arguments you would make. How would you counter, so if you're going to argue against it, how would you counter the arguments for? What sort of implications could be drawn negatively from, the opposing view? How would you sort of construct an argument like that?